All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Real Estate Case Files. This is where we take real world scenarios and talk through them so we can make sure these things don't happen to you. Kathy, good morning. Leo, good morning. Sarah, good morning. Everybody else on Facebook Live as well, drop a like or a comment. Let us know you're there. I appreciate you all being on. So we're going to dive in. So again, this is where we take real world scenarios, we talk through them, and we've got three topics here this morning that we are going to talk through. So the first one being, here's the issue. What can you do if the seller leaves personal items in the home? Who's had this happen recently? Who's had it happen in the past? I'm sure we've all dealt with it before. Sarah, do you see this a lot in handling a lot of contract to close? Are you seeing this as an issue that pops up often?
I don't see it often, but what I do see, and kind of, depending on your client, we've had one where the seller thought they were doing the buyer a favor by leaving relevant paint and relevant stain and even landscaping blocks that were used for the home in nice little piles in the garage, and the buyer wasn't having it.
Yeah, so good point, because people do think that often, like, well, I'll just leave everything. And sometimes buyers want it, but it's not always the case, especially if it's a ton. If it's like paint from 3 times ago that, the house was painted 10 years ago and there's still leftover paint, but the house has been painted a different color since then. And I've had a house in the past that had like 30 gallons of paint, like, a little bit in each gallon. The buyer didn't want that. It was all over the basement, 30 separate gallons of half-filled 10, 15-year-old paint. They just didn't want to get rid of it, and they wanted to leave it for the new buyer for that to be an issue. So it does happen. Things pop up, things get left in the home. So how do we overcome this? How can we avoid this? What is the best way to do that? Any thoughts?
I think there's two ways to remedy this. If you know that it's a home or a situation where maybe it's an older family and they've moved out and maybe they've left a lot of personal items, even when you wrote the contract, you could write it in the contract saying all personal items to be removed. That way, nobody's scrambling on closing day. Everybody is fully aware of what the buyer expects. And then also, if it's kind of a sudden last minute thing where the sellers are trying to help out with that paint or landscape blocks, you can use a walkthrough notice.
Yes, that's what I highly recommend. So I think there's two things. I think one, on the listing appointment, educating your client on removing all personal items. I think that's very, very important. Having that conversation ahead of time. We know that people, when they move into their homes, it's amazing how much stuff we accumulate. So letting them know ahead of time, look, when the home sells and you move out, we need to get everything out. And they may ask you then too, well, we've got some paint here or this or that. Should we leave that? And at that point, maybe you have that conversation with the buyer's agent when the house goes under contract. Look, they've got some, a couple of gallons of paint. They just recently painted the house. Does your client want it? Yes or no? So I think, addressing that ahead of time with the seller is going to be very important. And then to Sarah's point, the final walkthrough notice. A final walkthrough notice should be used every single time you close on a property and you represent a buyer. And it's one of the documents that doesn't get used a lot. So Sherry mentioned too, write it in the excluded area. You can definitely do that when you write the contract. Writing exclusions, things you want removed from the house when you write the offer. But the final walkthrough notice is a document that should definitely be used. And basically, if you haven't read that document, you want to utilize it for a few things. And one, I'm just going to read through it real quick. It says Part A, buyer acknowledges having waived the opportunity to conduct a final walkthrough of the property. So maybe they're out of town. They want you to do it. They don't want to do it. It's kind of a CYA document. Number 2 is buyer acknowledges having conducted the final walkthrough on this date and have viewed the property. And then number 3 is buyers acknowledging having conducted the final walkthrough on this date and have viewed the property and discovered one or more of the following items. 1, are not in the same condition, ordinary wear and tear expected as they were at the time of contract. 2, they are not satisfied and specified and agreed to in the inspection notice and or the contract. So if items weren't completed that were supposed to be done on the inspection notice, this is where you would utilize this document. 3 are not replaced or repaired in a workmanlike manner. Therefore, buyer requests satisfaction of the following items as specified below, and then you write things in.
Mm-hmm.
So the final walkthrough is going to solve most of your problems with stuff getting left behind. Also with issues like as I just mentioned, that if inspection repair work wasn't done correctly or in a workmanship manner, or maybe when they moved out of the house, the movers really banged up the house. I had that happen before, where tons of gashes in the walls and things like that coming up the basement stairs. That was something that had to get fixed. So utilizing the final walkthrough notice, I think, is very, very, very important. Sarah, how many of those do we see come across typically? Do we see it more often than not?
We don't require them as a brokerage level compliance item, but we did do it for every single buyer transaction on the team. And so,
Okay. Yeah.
like Michael said, it's a CYA document. You know, you could use it for they took the refrigerator and they shouldn't have. You've got, you know, damage when they moved out or when they pulled up a rug that you couldn't see. You know, the hard part about the final walkthrough notice is it's a supplemental doc. It's a day or two prior to closing, and it doesn't necessarily prevent the sellers and the buyers from closing. There's not really a huge obligation to the sellers to complete the items, but it does make them notice, and it does allow the buyers to put that in writing. So if it is a significant problem, do the final walkthrough notice, absolutely, but then you need to work on getting that closing date extended if for some reason the sellers are not willing or cannot make the repairs by the time the closing comes around.
Yeah, good point. So make sure of that. And then there's a seller response in that as well. So if you submit for the buyer, the seller will respond, and it says that they're going to satisfy the requirements identified above, or seller proposes to satisfy buyer in the following manner. So just keep that in mind. If for some reason you send this final walkthrough notice and all of a sudden it doesn't look like closing is going to happen, you have to follow the appropriate amendments then to move closing date, things of that nature. So final walkthrough notice, though, will for the most part handle any issues with the seller not leaving personal items in the home. But I also think prepping your sellers ahead of time from the beginning when you go on a listing appointment is going to be very important as well. The more you can educate your clients on that perhaps the buyer doesn't want all of the extra paint and things like that in the landscape block, as Sarah mentioned, and they don't want the garage full of stuff that maybe kind of goes with the house. Same thing is true with, like, maybe there's an above ground swimming pool that no longer works. If you want that removed, write it in the contract ahead of time. Don't wait until the day of closing and say, oh, we wanted this removed. Make sure those things are written in. And then again, utilize the final walkthrough notice. Anything else to add on that one, Sarah?
No, you know, it's really the buyer's prerogative, and it's their responsibility to make sure the home is in the condition in which they would like to purchase and sign the papers. So if there's anything that makes you hesitate about signing those papers, don't sign them. You know, get it extended.
Yep, very good point. All right, if you have questions, anyone watching, drop them in the comments. Oh, Kathy says not related, mutual release to sign. Oh, congrats. All right. Kathy's been trying to get a mutual release signed for a couple of days and having trouble with the other agent. So awesome. Good to hear. Good to hear. All right, let's move on to the next one. So problem 2, what happens if the home is found to be in a flood zone? So this can be a big issue. This can greatly affect people's insurance. There are a lot of things that can come in here. Now, keep in mind, one of the things in our sale contract, there is a clause in our sale contract. It's paragraph 20. I'm going to read through it real quick, line 347, and it says floodplain. So in our sale contract, there is a floodplain clause, and it says buyer may terminate this contract if any portion of the property is located in a designated 100-year floodplain unless disclosed to buyer in writing prior to contract. So they can terminate. If it was not disclosed, they can terminate if it wasn't disclosed prior to writing the offer. If it was disclosed, they cannot. If terminated, earnest money to be returned to buyer subject to paragraph 12. Failure by buyer to terminate within 10 days of actual knowledge of the 100-year floodplain or by closing, whichever occurs first, shall be deemed a waiver by the buyer of this contingency. So if it was not disclosed, we get into the property, and I had this happen a while back, and it turned out a small section of a yard. It was like 2 feet of the back corner of a pretty big lot was in a floodplain, and it became this huge issue. We didn't disclose it. My seller apparently didn't know. We found out later. So just keep that in mind. If the buyer is it's not disclosed, then they can terminate within 10 days out that it's in a floodplain. If it is disclosed though, and it's already in the MLS and it's disclosed, then they cannot. So Sarah, isn't there a floodplain map that people can use to see what properties are in floodplains?
Yes, in Maris, the big map that's got all the layers for school district and a bunch of other layers that you can turn on and off has a floodplain map. And I check it on every transaction, whether it's listing or buyer, just to make sure that we don't get 10 or 20 days in and figure out that this is a problem. We did have one in the past where it was fully disclosed. The buyers were fully aware, but when they went to get their insurance, the flood insurance was much more costly than they expected. And it was actually going to not allow them to be approved based on debt to income ratio and, the cost of owning the home. And so the sellers had a plan in place, and whatever their company was, it seemed to be a pretty inexpensive company. Comparatively to the other quotes that they were getting. And so what we ended up doing is the sellers worked and provided all of the contact information, and the buyers actually took over the home insurance or the flood part of the home insurance, whatever that meant. But there are ways that the sellers can help the buyers get through this if it is a known fact and they do end up having, an inexpensive flood insurance.
That's a good point. So I think that I would definitely recommend that if you know it's in a floodplain ahead of time, then make sure you're getting quotes on insurance. Ask the seller's agent who they currently utilize. Maybe they've got cheaper insurance than the existing insurance company your buyer's using, but make sure you get quotes prior to, because sometimes it can be significant, as Sarah just mentioned there. Like flood insurance can be significantly more than people might be thinking, and it can really throw off their monthly payment. So yeah, good points there. Anything else you've seen pop up with issues like this, Sarah?
No, not really. The flood insurance also can fall, under the home insurance contingency, but also loan commitment, so it's not something that necessarily pops up within the first couple of days like it should. Sometimes the lenders do their due diligence and find that it's in a floodplain or find that the cost is too high. So getting ahead of this problem is always best.
Agreed. So that's why utilizing that floodplain map in Maris is really important. Highly recommend everybody look at that. Like Sarah mentioned, she uses it all the time. So I think it's very important to utilize that feature to find out if it is in a floodplain. But keep in mind too, if you find out later it's in a floodplain and it was not disclosed, your buyer can get out of that contract within a 10-day period once they have knowledge of it. Scott has a question. If you have a trusted insurance person, they can run a quick quote to find out if it's costly. Yes, absolutely. So great point. Make sure we're doing that. Make sure if we're looking at properties and maybe just a small section, because that does happen. Sometimes not the whole property is in the floodplain. There's a creek running behind a house, and in a certain number of feet of the lot is a floodplain, but not the physical house itself. Make sure we find that out and we get quotes. So to Scott's point, if you have a trusted insurance person, call them right away, let them know, and they can run a quick quote for you. So, and then also if the quotes are coming in high, maybe ask the listing agent who the current seller utilizes. Maybe the cost is lower. So good things to keep in mind, good things to know. There's nothing worse though than maybe it was disclosed and we just missed it. So we wrote the offer and we didn't see it was in a floodplain. Now it should be written in the seller's disclosure that it's in a floodplain. It should also be listed in the MLS as well. And then you can utilize the map features in the MLS to check for that also. So we've got as a responsibility for us as realtors to make sure we're checking those things and looking at that prior to showing property and prior to writing offers, because there's nothing worse than you write the offer and we just didn't look at it. We get the house accepted and then we find out it's in a floodplain and it was disclosed the whole time. We signed the seller's disclosure, we didn't read it. Or the buyer signed the seller's disclosure, but we didn't take the time to read through it. We didn't look on the MLS sheet to see if it was in a floodplain. We didn't check the flood map in Maris. So make sure we're doing that. I think it's really important. Anything else to add in that?
I think that's about it.
Yeah, but that has happened before where it was disclosed and then the offer gets accepted and then we find out it just pops up again that it's in a floodplain and it was disclosed the whole time. Makes the realtor look really, really bad that they didn't catch that. So just make sure we're staying on top of that. Last one here. What happens if the appraisal comes in under value? We're starting to see this pop up more. Hasn't been much of an issue for a while, but we're starting to see it happen more. So first of all, we know we have the appraisal rider. So if we write the offer and it has the appraisal rider and the contract is contingent upon financing, we've got some options. So let's just read through the appraisal rider real quick. This contract is also contingent upon the property appraising for not less than the purchase price by an appraiser selected by buyer's lender. If the property does not appraise for the purchase price or higher and the buyer elects to act on this contingency, buyer shall deliver a copy of the appraisal to the seller or listing broker within 2 days after it's available from buyer's lender. So that's an important thing right there. Make sure as soon as you get the appraisal, hey, it did not appraise out, we're notifying the listing agent right away and we're sending a copy of the appraisal within a 2-day time frame. Don't let this drag out. Don't let it go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 a week and then send it. It's within 2 days. Very, very important that we're getting that. Now, if seller does not agree by written notice to buyer or seller broker to adjust the purchase price to the appraised value within 5 days after receipt of appraisal by seller or listing broker, then buyer at buyer's option may terminate this contract with earnest money to be returned to buyer, subject to paragraph 12 of the contract. So basically, we have 2 dates there. We have 2 days. Once we find out it didn't appraise, we have 2 days to get it to the listing agent. And then the list seller then has 5 days to make a decision on what they want to do. They can either adjust their price down to the appraisal price, or they can say, we're not going to do it. We're not going to sell it at that price. Contract will terminate. Your buyer gets the earnest money returned. But your buyer also has the option to bring additional money to the table. Let's say they love the house and it's a very special, specific property that appraised for 10,000 under. Seller says, nope, we're not reducing 10,000. Buyer has the option to make up the difference and bring money. What else on that, Sarah, that we need to be on the lookout for?
I think that pretty much covers it. This is one of the benefits of having a well-qualified buyer. And if they have, a significant chunk of money to bring to the table, that's what allows the sellers to feel more comfortable for situations like this, that just in case the appraisal comes back low, the sellers have a little bit of wiggle room there to still make it work because they know that the buyers have, an amount to bring and they can maybe reach an agreement. But also on the seller side, if you decide not to sell, you need to pay attention to what kind of loan type it is. If it happens to be an FHA home appraisal, those actually stick with the home. And so I don't know that the timeline, but I think that you're stuck with that appraised price for 90 days or something like that. So before you deny and say, well, I'm just going to go back onto the market, you will have, by the time you get back under contract and get a new appraisal, you could potentially have new comps that would bring that price up. But if you're FHA, you're going to be stuck with that price for a certain period of time.
That's a really good point. You think it's 90 days? I don't recall the number of days on that.
I usually lean on my lenders. I want to say 90, but
yeah, we'll have to check on that. We'll let everybody know on that one because I know it's good for 100. I think it's valid for 180, but yeah, I'm not sure how long it stays with. So that's a really good point too, to educate our sellers on that as well. Now, I'd be curious for people watching, anyone had appraisal issues lately? Drop it in the comments if you have. Has anyone had any kind of appraisal issues though? We haven't seen a ton of them, but they do happen. That's for sure. So just keep that in mind though. That's why the appraisal rider is important. We all know that. It's also been a tool that we haven't really utilized a whole lot as far as I'd say, because of the market over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of appraisals get waived. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a negotiation tactic, but also make sure that you're really, really studying the market and you're doing your market research on the property to make sure you feel very confident that it's going to appraise out, because we are slowly starting to see more homes like just barely appraise and starting a little bit to come in under value. Again, we haven't seen a ton of it, but it's a very common thing in the past. Maybe not in the last 3 years or so, but before that, prior to 2020, we would see more appraisal issues than we have in the last handful of years. So I think that's really important. I think it's important to know your appraisal rider. I think it's important to read the appraisal rider to understand it, and especially those deadlines. If you get that appraisal back and it comes in low, you have 2 days. Keep in mind that. And then your seller has 5 days. If you're representing the seller and they submit the appraisal that came in low, your seller has 5 days to make a decision. We do have a question here. Lower appraisal, seller immediately offered to lower the price, small difference about $3,000. So Diana had an issue. It was a $3,000 difference. Seller immediately said, no problem, we'll take it. So very important. I think it's important too, what Sarah mentioned on the FHA aspect of it too, that appraisal does stick with the property for a period of time. So just keep that in mind. So it looks like, yeah, for people watching, we haven't had a whole lot of issues with that, just some coming in a little bit low. And I feel that it's rare that you see something that comes in significantly low as well. Most of the time they come in right at, or as Diana just mentioned here, just a couple thousand under. So it's rare. Anything else with appraisals though? I think one, study the market, know the offer price that you're making. We can generally know too. I mean, if a house is sitting there, let's say for like a month and it doesn't have offers, well, it's probably overpriced, right? I always say if a listing is getting a lot of activity and no offers, we're 4 to 6% off on price. If it's getting very low showings, we're 6 to 10% off. And if we're not getting any showings at all, it's 10% or greater. So if you go into a house and it's been on the market for 30 days and you're the very first showing and you call the agent, no one is signed in, you call the agent, how's the activity been? Actually, you're the first showing we've had. Well, the house is probably 10% off on price or more potentially. So keep that in mind as well. Before you submit an offer, I probably wouldn't encourage my buyer to write a full price offer on that, because it's probably, if it's a $500K house, it's 50 grand off on price minimum. So keep that in mind as well. That's, from a pricing perspective, when working with the buyers, you can really comp the properties the same way you would if you had a listing. So that's what I always do. If I'm writing an offer on a buyer's home, I'm going to run a quick market research on it or market analysis and run the property the same way I would if I was going on a listing appointment. I'm going to see what that property is worth, what I feel it should have been listed at. Maybe it's priced correctly, or maybe it's super high. Scott also says the seller and buyer can split the difference as well. Absolutely. So that's always an option as well. $10,000 difference on appraisal. Buyer says, I'll come up 5. Seller says, I'll drop 5. Let's make the deal work and go. Mm-hmm. So there are always solutions to this as well. I think it's just very important that we work with the other agent. And at the end of the day, the other agent we're working together to accomplish the same goal. Our goal is to get our buyers the home, and their goal is to sell the home for the seller. So work with our fellow agents on these transactions as well. Let's see what we can do to work together as much as possible to come to a resolution to make these things happen. Any other thoughts on the appraisal, Sarah?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. It's one of these situations where you really have to work with the listing agent if you're on the buy side, and find that there's more realtors than you would realize that don't understand that they can meet in the middle. So
yeah,
so your stuff, and you can help the other agents that maybe don't read the docs.
Agreed. So yeah, very good point. So that's why we like to do these things, though, is just to drop in to make sure that we're running through real world scenarios, things that happen. If you had a scenario that's come up and you were like, never had that happen before, and you want us to talk through it, make sure to email us, send the emails to compliance@networkglobal.com, and we'll make sure we get them on here. We do this every 4 to 6 weeks. We run a case files thing where we're just taking real world scenarios. So if you had something pop up that you were uncertain, you've never dealt with it before, you felt like it was odd, make sure to email us and we'll make sure we add it to this and talk through it. So that's all we've got for today. We appreciate everybody being on, and that's it. Have a great week. Have a great rest of the week. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.